Good afternoon, my name is Olga Aivazovska and I want to thank everybody who joins us in Ukraine Media Center, Ukrinform. It's day 516 of the full-scale invasion of our homeland by Russian aggressor. It's been 10 years of the war, and traditionally I want to thank all the mass media who tell the world the truth about our heroic resistance. Today we have invited you to talk about a very interesting thing. We are about to present two studies: the study of the media consumption and civil activity of Ukrainians abroad, and another study is about the number of Ukrainians and their migration abroad as a result of the war. It's an important topic. I want to introduce our speakers. It's Olga Aivazovska, chair of the board of OPORA Civic Network, Anastasia Romaniuk, analyst at OPORA, Andriy Savchuk, data analyst at OPORA, and Olga Snopok, analyst at OPORA. Good afternoon. I would like to give the floor to Miss Olga so she tells us about the studies, why are they important, and how they can help us. Thank you very much. I want to thank for your interest. Regardless the summertime, now we are frequently asked that during the war, should we keep talking about the democracy, potential political processes, freedom of speech, and so on. It's a challenge to me, because if we don't plan any post-war recovery of the rights and freedom after the war, we may lose the peace. And since Ukrainians don't live in a dimension of the Ukrainian borders, we have become a global nation. To forecast any further stages, we need to look at the topic of migration in a number of dimensions. We have to hold the studies to at least start talking about the scenarios that can be implemented during post-war period. What exactly the migration influences on, and what influences the migration, because without the data we obviously won't be able to see what the Ukrainian society and the state will look like in 10 years of, if say the active phase of the war ends within a year or 2 or 5, and without those efforts we cannot invest any intellectual resources into human capital. So the discussion about the post-war recovery, such discussions are going on all around the world. It's being paid attention by the big business, but very little is said about the education or renewal of the human capital, of creation of the conditions to have the Ukrainians come back home in case there will be an opportunity to reunite with the families, the opportunity in terms of the security situation. So we started this study to talk not in this dimension that there will be 10 or 15 million of people left in Ukraine after the war, or everybody comes back after the war, but to forecast the scenarios that we influence on, or the Russian Federation influences on, performing some activities that influence the migration. Another pressing topic is the topic of post-war recovery and return to the democratic fundamentals, in the fact that the Ukrainians should manage their state through the legal means, for example through the elections, which means that if we keep it silent, someone else somehow prepares their election campaigns that can be potentially organized after the martial law termination, but it's transformed into the closed club of the people who have access to the information. So we want to bring it from under the cover of political, from under the political reps into the public dimension. This is something that makes us different from Russian Federation, something that helps the global community to support Ukraine financially, militarily, and politically. Now there is a political struggle in United States of America, and one of the topics brought up by the pro-Russian groups and radical communities in the United States is that Ukraine does not organize the elections in autumn, which means Ukraine is not democracy, so they should not be allocated any resources from the American budget, and the American budget has been formed not by calendar years but in the beginning of October every year, and this process is already underway. And it means whether our military will have shells, ammunition and heavy vehicles, plus the aviation that we count on. I'm talking about the coalition that was formed in the political dimension. I'm talking about the F-16 fighters, but it should be implemented in practice. So getting back to the topic, why do we talk about the politics in Ukraine in the summer during the martial law? Because we have lost the opportunity to take some decisions in a timely manner. So if there will be an elections within 2, 3 or 4 years, we are already behind, because the post-war processes will be going on in a very difficult conditions. I mean, the threats, war threats, cybersecurity threats, and so on and so forth, because we have to talk about the previously occupied territories which are de facto under the control of Russian Federation, beyond the control of Ukrainian government, and what to do with those citizens who got Russian passports. Are they entitled to take part in the political processes on par with the citizens who have not done it, or for those whose legal interests were defended by the government, protected by the government? For example, I'm talking about the citizens who live in the territories that were liberated after the 24th of February 2022, Kherson, Kharkiv and Kiev regions. So the scope of this issue is so extensive that without the data, without the studies in Ukraine and abroad, without appealing to this topic, which looks a little bit not so urgent, first of all, we can lose the support of our Western partners, because I've gave you the example of the United States. That discourse is not unique to the United States, but the United States are a key partner who can financially and militarily support us in the amounts necessary for the armed forces of Ukraine. And we cannot admit the emergence of such topic that Ukraine is not a democracy because we keep under the wraps some problems that we have to solve within those years. We just don't have right for that, because otherwise we will play on the side of the aggressor country. So we've studied a number of issues. Some of them are in development now. We're trying to get some unique data that are not available from any organization. And I think that profound understanding by the journalists, by the partners, our colleagues, of the fact that we cannot wait for the recovery after the end of the war and the military come back home and they will take care of dealing with all the problems. It's obligation of the civilians to work on having those problems solved before the end of the war. I'm talking about the corruption and rule of law and proper governance, rather than adding some additional responsibility to those who already have enough of it. So our topics today will be migration, internal and external, motivation of the people for coming back home, the channels of communication. It's important for journalists and political actors. And if we want to promulgate something in the good meaning of this word, if we want to spread the information among our citizens in different dimensions, both in Ukraine and outside, we have to know where that audience resides. What is the information that they trust, where they consume that information on a daily basis. So there will be more and more of such studies coming from our end, and we hope that in the autumn we will start discussing the solutions with the government offices who are responsible for that, because they exist at the expense of our taxpayers, responsible for solution of the issues they're responsible of, including migration and political decisions. Ms. Olga, thank you very much for bringing those topics up already. Now, Mr. Andriy, I want to invite you to discussion of the first study. What have you studied? What were the conclusions drawn? Our study about the migration is interesting from that standpoint that we have a lot of figures. They are somewhat different, but they confirm that there is a catastrophic trend that Ukrainians, regardless of their age, well, a little bit depending on the gender, because there is certain legislation in effect now, they live abroad, mostly because of the Russian shellings. Olga mentioned democracy. Democracy is impossible without demography, without the people, and the amount of population for Ukraine is quite a complicated issue, because even before the beginning of the full-scale invasion, we had different methodologic approaches, different evaluations to find out what is the number of Ukrainians living in Ukraine. You remember in the 90s there was such an optimistic commercial, it's 52 billion of us, and it was far from reality even back then. But if we take the indicators provided by the government, that is 7.3 million of residents of Ukraine, that's the evaluation by the cell carriers performed in 2019. It did not include the population of Crimea and previously occupied territories. Meanwhile, the State Statistics Service did not count Crimea only. So the difference was 37 and 3, and it ranged up to 43 to 8, and the World Bank estimated the population of Ukraine at the level of 44 million. So to understand the tendency now, we cannot understand which figure we should rely upon. So the most probable, there was a figure around 40 million to the figure provided by the statistics services and mobile operators, the open source data. There is a commission regulating the telecommunication services, so they were closer to that figure of 41 billion. So that's the figure we should probably rely upon. Unfortunately, State Statistics Service was talking about the catastrophic tendency, about 420,000 decrease of population on annual basis. The mortality rate prevailing, the birth rate, the economic migration of the younger people, and as a consequence, even before the full-scale invasion, it was necessary to say that if we are optimistic, within the period of our independence, the population of Ukraine decreased 8 million, and the Russian invasion in February 2022 just intensified those tendencies, and what was going on for decades, in fact, happened within the first couple of months. If we look at the following figures, we have data from Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs about the fact that as of 21st of June 2023, there are 8,177,000 Ukrainians abroad. Again, MFA doesn't say that these are all Ukrainians who left abroad as a result of Russian invasion, but it's still a colossal number. You don't have to be a prominent mathematician to understand that it's 20% of the population that was present in Ukraine before the February 22. So the tendency is negative. If we apply to the MFA for a couple of times for updated information, and we see the number of Ukrainians abroad only increases to a number of reasons. Someone in fact lives abroad because of the security situation. For somebody, more important are the humanitarian aspects of life. So it's generally a little bit difficult to count Ukrainians abroad, because Ukrainians don't register with the consulates. Only 1 in 16 Ukrainians gets registered with consulates. It's like 8% of the Ukrainians. And even of the Ukrainians abroad, but according to the details from the MFA, it keeps happening. So talking about the facts related to Russian aggression, we have to address the state border guard service, and we see that there is top section of the border with Poland. Again, the number of border crossings is both sides, but it's easy to understand that given the Russian aggression, the balance will be negative. The most people will be leaving without coming back. So Poland received the biggest number of Ukrainians. It's both confirmed by the data of the United States High Commissioner for Refugees and the State Bodyguard Service of Ukraine and MFA of Ukraine. MFA of Ukraine says that half of the Ukrainians of those 8 million mentioned are based in 3 countries. Poland, then goes Germany. Well, we understand that people were going to Germany from Poland, and then is the United States of America. Generally, there is a lot of Ukrainians in Czech Republic, Italy, Canada, Israel, but again, we don't clearly understand what was the number who left due to the Russian invasion. If we talk about the State Bodyguard Service, in fact, the balance is catastrophic. As of the 1st May, there was minus 2.7 million of people, so difference between those who left and those who came back was negative. And if we check the figures, we see that starting from December 2022 until March 23, about 1.8 million people left. So those are the dates of the strikes on the energy infrastructure, of the blackouts. So this is how the people were saving themselves. And those Russian strikes inflicted upon the center of Odessa are united with some scheduled strikes when Russia has withdrawn unilaterally from the grain deal and now are destroying the Ukrainian grain infrastructure. They demonstrate that security will be always the priority. If we check some other details, we may say that the balance, talking about the UN data, it was improving maybe last autumn. Some number of people were coming back home, for example, to get their children back to schools, but Russian strikes demonstrate that security is #1 priority, and before there will be full security in Ukraine, people will continue living. So negative tendencies about the number of people of Ukraine only confirmed the data that I have already mentioned, those which are in disposal of the telecommunications services who regulate the cell carriers. They say that there are 48 million SIM cards in Ukraine, and according to special calculation techniques, they say that 143 SIM cards account for 100 people. So putting together the proportion, we may say that there should be 34 million people in Ukraine, and they demonstrate the tendency to shrinkage, which says that if we talk abstract, because the SIM cards are not people, but the technique can help us say that by the year 2023 the number of people in Ukraine has become 700,000 less. But we see the regions which recovered their pre-war population, for example Kiev with a population of 3 million, but in Dnipropetrovsk or Kharkiv region receives a lot of internally displaced persons, and it's yet another very complicated challenge. And the most recent data for the time being are the data from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, people who stay abroad now. They say that those are the people who were forced to leave their homes as a result of Russian invasion. They state the number of 5 million, those who stay in Europe for the time being, because UNHCR is an organization which protects the refugees, and they operate the data provided by the governments of European countries and other countries such as Canada or United States, where the Ukrainians are numerous too. We see the number of Ukrainians abroad was growing, and now it has decreased a little bit, but it's not a result of Ukrainians coming back in mass, but one of the reasons, probable reasons, is that in some countries the programs for protection of Ukrainians disappear or get transformed, and statistically it becomes more difficult to count Ukrainians abroad, and the details from UNHCR demonstrate that now there are more Ukrainians living not in Poland but in Germany. But again, are those data 100% precise? It's difficult because UN is a global organization and they use data from Russia too. We don't know the number of Ukrainians forcibly deported by Russians. We know about them deporting Ukrainian children, and there is a warrant to punish those people. Some might say it's inefficient, but Putin stated that he's not going to South Africa anyway because he's got frightened, he's got scared. But that's a topic for different conversation. So if we see those dynamics on this graph, I understand the numbers may be complicated and not so interested, but they demonstrate that Ukrainians keep leaving Ukraine, and the balance within the last 10 months grew by 2+ million of those who left and never returned. So we had a number of waves when Ukrainians were leaving right after the beginning of the invasion, then after the beginning of energy infrastructure strikes and blackouts, and there are different studies, questionings, but the tendency still remains negative. And the last thing, internally displaced persons, there are numerous in Ukraine. According to the estimates of the Ministry of Social Policies, the number does not fluctuate a lot within the last couple of months. It's about 4.7 million internally displaced people scattered across different regions, and the majority of them are women. 60% of them are women, plus 40% men, but that's yet another challenge, specifically if we talk about the recovery of certain regions. There are cities that were destroyed to the ground by Russia, let alone the organization of elections. Many people just don't understand how complicated it is to ensure the actual voting, the actual presence of the members of the election committees. So if we summarize it, the figures that were pronounced by some organizations, that number of residents of Ukraine is lower than 30 million people, they are intended to intimidate, but still there is a negative trend, and United Nations said that the number of people living in Ukraine amounts to 36 million Ukrainians. So I think we should stick to this figure, but what's gonna happen within a year or two, we cannot say. We don't know. We don't know whether there will be another million waves of migration that may start in September or October if Russians try to strike our energy infrastructure again, to break the spirit of Ukrainians and to intimidate everybody with their terror. Mr. Andriy, I have a couple of questions to you right away about the techniques used during your study and about the figure. Why should we rely upon the figure of 8 million if we say that the same UNHCR declares this number at the level of 5.6, 5.7 million? Well, again, the methodology is the following. We were using the data from the official government offices, and we were looking where can we pick some more data, for example, like with the number of SIM cards. So we didn't make up the numbers. The most interesting, what I've mentioned, they are different. For example, MFA says about 8 million, United Nations say about 5+ million, and this figure of 8 million is formed as follows. For example, the Russians, they submit their number to the United Nations, so all along the front lines, the state bodyguard service
they don't control this part of the border. So they submit the data to United Nations, and within different periods the number of Ukrainians was fluctuated between 1 and 3 million people. According to the data from State Bodyguard Service, the crossings of the border with Russia and Belarus does not even reach 10,000 people. So those are details that are related to the exchange of prisoners of war or something like that. So we don't trust Russian data. If we take a big figure, we take the data from the United Nations, we add something that was submitted by Russia, and this is how we come to this 8 million figure. So I'm more inclined to consider the number of 5+ million people, because the other ones may be a diaspora who was living in Ukraine, or some who may not have returned to Ukraine with the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Thank you very much, Miss Anastasia. Let's continue about the study. Thank you. Thank you very much for your attention, for your topic. Let's start the presentation of our next study, which is made up of 2 parts: the political activity and media consumption of the Ukrainians abroad. And right away I would like to proceed to the methodology. In short, it was consistent of 3 phases. The first part is the questioning of Ukrainians about the civil and political activity of the Ukrainians who are based abroad. It covers 7 countries: Great Britain, Italy, Spain, Germany, United States, Hungary, and Czech Republic. Another question was about the media consumption about the Ukrainians abroad. I will tell you in detail, or my colleague will tell you in detail a little bit more about this phase. And the third part was the profound interviews covering both thematic blocks. So what we've seen, first of all, we've seen that the majority of respondents within the last half a year was resorting to this or those means to support Ukraine. It was mostly financial or information support. For example, donations to the armed forces of Ukraine, which is the most popular type of support, the financial aid to the relatives and family, popularization of information about Ukraine in their local communities, and so on. As to the coming back to Ukraine, we've seen that there is some comforting data. The majority of the respondents have plans to come back to Ukraine. But what we've also seen, there is a tendency that the more the Ukrainians are adapted abroad, depending on whether they have high income job, whether they speak local language, or what are their relations with the local population, well, it all influences their plans to come back or not to come back to Ukraine. Also, what Ukrainians are guided by in their decision to come back to Ukraine in terms of period. So the 3 most popular factors that stimulate the return, first of all, is the emotional connection to the home. Second, it's reestablishment of security in the region and unification with the family. And we've seen some age difference. For example, for the younger population, the most important factor is the availability of job in Ukraine. Meanwhile, for the older ones is the factor of establishment of security in their region. And for those above 51, the emotional connection to Ukraine is the most important factor. So staying abroad, the respondents mostly were divided in their opinion whether they can influence the political life of Ukraine. Only 15% of Ukrainians said that yes, they can influence the political life of Ukraine. Meanwhile, 37% said that most likely not, and 7% said absolutely not. And when we were holding some profound interviews, this question mostly confused the respondents, because one of the ways to influence their community, their local community, was not something that they considered as a way to support Ukraine remotely. Another thing, they were talking about the elections process, something that is not happening now. So the Ukrainian respondents were mostly confused about the possibility to influence the political decisions, but they named the signing of petitions, information support, and participation in the manifestations. Also, the respondents mentioned financial and information support of the armed forces of Ukraine as the way to influence the political life in Ukraine, as a way of democratic struggle. So about the elections, after the termination of the martial law, only 16% of respondents think that the election should be held right upon the termination of the martial law, and 30% more said they are ready to wait about a year. Meanwhile, 28% of the respondents are ready to wait from 3 to 6 months, and 13% of the respondents said they are ready to wait a couple of years for the first elections to take place. As to the opportunity to vote during the first elections after the war, more than 78% say that they will vote if they will be physically based in Ukraine. If they would be staying abroad, the biggest percentage about the likability of voting, probability of voting, is the electronic voting. It's mostly the same number as given the physical presence in Ukraine. A little bit smaller number of people says that they will vote for sure if the elections take place either classically in the election sites, voting sites abroad, or if it will be voting by mail. So 60% stand for classical voting abroad at the voting site, and 59% for the voting by mail. A little bit different is the situation with the trust to the results of the elections, and the biggest percentage was given to the procedure mostly familiar for the respondents, the personal visit to the voting site. 19% fully trust this procedure. The lower level of trust is to the electronic voting, and the lowest is to the voting by mail. And upon the results of the profound interviews, we've seen that the most trust different ways of voting is defined by the personal experience of respondents, because when we talk about the voting by mail, the respondents said they don't trust this form of voting only due to the problems they were facing in their experience with the mail in the country of their stay, or with the Ukrainian mail. So those respondents who had personal experience of use of such applications as DIA, or those who have the high level of media literacy, so the older respondents were looking at electronic voting more critically and talking about the personal visit to voting site. It was the mostly trusted way of voting, but the respondents say about a number of concerns about how the process will be organized, because the first thing that comes to the mind of the respondents is the huge lines that may be formed if the voting will be organized in the same way as it was during the previous elections. And if they will have to wait in the long lines, those who come to vote, they mostly say that they will wait as long as it's necessary, but the bigger problem is that the probability of people coming to the sites is lower, because the respondents say that first of all, they don't know whether they will be able to take a day off to come to the diplomatic office that may be only located in the capital of the country of their stay, and the way to this site may be long and difficult. And mostly when the respondents talk about electronic and mail voting, they talk about them as the way to overcome those challenges posed by the personal visit to the voting site, should the voting be held just in the same way that it was going on before the full-scale invasion. So there's a number of quotations by our respondents which were expressed during the profound interviews. Some of them were concerned whether they will have enough financial resources to come to the voting site. Another one was concerned with the question at whose expense the letters will be delivered during the voting by mail. And they said that DIA is the easiest way to deal with the challenges mentioned. Thank you. Thank you, Miss Olga. Please continue. Good afternoon, everybody. The second part of our big study covering 7 countries was dedicated to the media consumption of Ukrainians abroad, and in fact we wanted to find out how our refugees consume information, what are the platforms they consume information from, what they're looking for in those platforms. And it's important to understand at the level of the civil society and the state and media, because only understanding all those nuances we can objectively communicate the information to our people abroad and not to lose the connection with them. And in fact, if we talk about the connection, the first thing we were asking from Ukrainians abroad was whether the people are interested about what's going on in Ukraine and in the country of their stay. And we see there's a huge interest to the situation in Ukraine on both state and local levels, and Ukrainian political events enjoy more interest. 82% of respondents followed the political life in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the life of the community, of the village the people were coming from, only 44% of those who left their homes are still curious about what's going on in their home. And as the respondents said during their profound interviews, they are curious about the events related to the full-scale invasion. They monitor the situation in the front lines, the situation with the missile strikes. Some respondents say that they're also curious about the social and political events in Ukraine, political events, and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, they are less interested with what's going on in the country of their state, and that fraction of respondents who are interested about the political life at the countries of their state are those who left before the beginning of the full-scale invasion and lived there for a long time. So many people pick messengers and social networks. Is the same situation in Ukraine. Those sources of information are prevailing, because abroad the messengers are used by 50% of respondents and 47% use social networks. Twice as rare the respondents ask for information from their friends in Ukraine, their relatives, their families, and they watch videos in YouTube, so it's 22%. What's interested to consume the news from television, only 8% of Ukrainians abroad use television, unlike Ukraine, where this percentage, the number of Ukrainians getting news from the television, is 62%. Abroad it's only 8%. So talking about radio, printed media, Ukrainians almost never use them abroad. At the same time, the respondents give their preference to different types of contents in different platforms. For example, TV messengers and news websites. 62% of Ukrainians use them only for news and 27% for articles, analytic reports, studies, and so on and so forth. I mean, anything other than news. But in the social networks, 30% of the respondents, they say that they get news and read personal channels. And we see the trend that in the social networks, people are equally interested about the news content and the interpretation by some leaders of thoughts. It's mostly visible in YouTube because 67% of the respondents use the author's channels there. Meanwhile, only 23% use YouTube for news. We've asked the respondents in more details in about every of those platforms, and the most popular way to get information are the messengers. We've asked which is the one used most frequently. It was Telegram. 89% of users, 81% of Ukrainians abroad use it, and the second place is taken by Viber with 6%. This indicator is different because, for example, in the United States, only for 14% of the Ukrainians use Viber, but Telegram is still prevailing in all countries, in all groups. And in fact, regardless the gender, and responding to the question why specifically Telegram, they said that it's the most convenient way to obtain information. The mostly used in Telegram are the aggregator channels. The news channels are used by 25% and the aggregators by 39%. The author channels are read by 22% of the respondents. We've also asked the respondents which are the Telegram channels mostly used by them to get the news. Among top 5s among the aggregators were Lachin Rights and a number of anonymous Telegram channels like Truha, Insider UA, and so on and so forth. About the top 5 Telegram channels of the mass media mentioned by the reporters were TSN, Union, Suspilne, Belarusian channel Nexta, and Hromadska. The situation is a little bit different in Viber. Meanwhile, in Telegram, the users use mostly aggregators. In Viber, 37% of the respondents use mass media channels and 23% use aggregators. In Viber, the respondents get the information from friends and family and different chats, unlike in Telegram. And mentioning the channels, everybody says Suspilne, Movlina, and Kraina Info. The social networks are used by the respondents, by 47% of the respondents, and the most popular is predictably Facebook, which is used by 43% of those questioned. The second place is taken by Instagram with 22%. And meanwhile, about 25 respondents in Ukraine get news from TikTok. Only 7% of respondents use it abroad, plus 3% who use Twitter, and 18% who say that they use different social networks for the news. So in social networks we see some differentiation by content which interests Ukrainian users. In Facebook and Instagram, those are videos and news from the mass media. 30% of the users get this information from mass media. The posts of the experts, politicians, bloggers, which are also a source for news for the 1/3 of the users, and they are mostly used, but to the lesser extent than the mass media. The situation is different with Twitter. More than 50% gets information from tweets of politicians, experts, and bloggers. Meanwhile, only about 25% of that social network users get information from the news accounts. from the mass media accounts. So the news sites are the source of information for Ukrainians abroad, and 74% of the respondents use the Ukrainian websites. Meanwhile, 6% resort to the international websites or websites of the countries of their stay. Fortunately, nobody uses Russian news websites, but talking about the content, Ukrainians are mostly interested in the news from the news website. 62% say that they come there for the news, and about a third say that they also read different analytical reports, investigations, and so on and so forth. YouTube is one of the main sources of information for 22% of respondents. YouTube is a little bit different from other platforms because news there end up on the second place. They are being consumed by 23% of respondents, and the majority, 67%, get information about Ukraine watching videos by different bloggers, experts, and so on and so forth. And we've asked the respondents whom they can mention, whom they watch mostly. So the most watched was the YouTube channel of Serhiy Stranenko, and we see some popularity of Oleg Zhdanov, Mark Fakin, Roman Svitan, and Alexey Arestovich. The TV that I've mentioned got quite a low score by the Ukrainians abroad, only 8%, 63% of which watch Ukrainian TV channels. They watch News United television marathon, plus 13% of the respondents watch the channels of the country of their state, plus 10% watch the Ukrainian channels that are not added to the News United marathon. Only 1% uses Russian TV channels. For those for whom television is the main source of information, 69% of them are mostly interested in the news, plus 16% watch the experts or different interviews. So we've asked the respondents what is the level of their trust to different sources of information, and the social networks enjoyed the highest level of trust. Mostly 85% of the Ukrainians abroad trust them. About 76% said they trust the news websites, and the highest level of distrust was to the news in the TV and printed media. 56 and 59% respectively. Thank you very much. That's a very profound research with a lot of interesting figures to analyze, to model the situation. So, Ms. Olga, I would like you to summarize what's the most important of those figures, what's most important for our society and for our government actors. What would you like to focus their attention on? Thank you very much, but maybe there are any questions from the floor. Yes, we do have. Good afternoon, Rakuta. Anastasia, Ukrinform. Can you please tell us in which countries were the Ukrainians left to after the beginning of the full-scale invasion? The political activity of the Ukrainians is the highest, and also in what countries were Ukrainians left to upon the beginning of the full-scale invasion? The number of Ukrainians has grown along with their political activity, and where it was decreased. Thank you very much for your question, but we may only talk about the impressions because no one was measuring anything about the political activity of Ukrainians abroad before the 24th of February 2022. And in the same way, the old diaspora, honestly, they were more of a closed society. I mean, talking in terms of a number of public events held during, say, the last year compared to the new diaspora. So honestly, your question is of a more mathematic nature. The more Ukrainians there are in the country, the more is their activity after the 24th of February. But there are unique countries which are considered the capitals of decision-making, where both the old and the new wave of migrants, they express their political activities, because where the decisions are taken, the more is the responsibility of the Ukrainian diaspora there to influence on those decisions. They understand their scale of responsibility, because in the United States there is a lot of initiatives, and one of the most famous is Razum, probably, that was organized, who organized a lot of political education activities, which is executed there to make sure that every congressman and senator voting for the allocation of funds for the defense of Ukraine from the budget could orient at them, because they are the voters in the and in the democratic countries. It's very important, because one thing is for the Ukrainian refugees to go out in a manifestation with a symbolic purpose, and yet another thing is when Ukrainians get united and they systemically advocate and press on the decision makers in the countries which are the key countries for the political decisions in relation of Ukraine. But according to our observations, very active diaspora, both all the new wave of those who look for refuge is the United States, Poland, Germany. In Great Britain, for example, there are programs aimed at the support of Ukrainians. They have certain influence too. For example, Britain, through the program of shelter, they diversify Ukrainians all across the country. So it's difficult to gather one big group in one place. Meanwhile, in Poland, there is a lot of shelters where Ukrainians were getting temporary refuge, or they were hubs, such as migration hubs, for the further travel to European Union countries. There was a mass concentration of Ukrainians, and small organized groups, they only got mobilized for the big events, for big manifestations. It was visible within the first 6 to 8 months, and again in the United States and Poland, and in part in Germany, Ukrainian diaspora has become systemic. They work for the specific advocacy within specific campaigns that have or have not some results. One of the most mass campaign is the support of Ukrainian membership in NATO. It's not over yet, because this decision could not have been taken in the form satisfactory for us during the Vilnius summit, but the solidarity manifestations were organized by Ukrainians in all the NATO member countries. So we can assert that the Ukrainians abroad, they transform into a power that may influence the agenda of those countries where they have become voters. And when we analyze migration, we have to understand that in Poland, for example, the Ukrainians get different type of paperwork. So the decreasing number of citizens of Ukraine, or those who are considered by Poland as those looking for temporary refuge, they have the form of legalization of our citizens in their countries transforming, and the longer the war continues, the more difficult it will be to track those issues. When we talk about the political process, for example, if Ukrainians abroad get a refugee passport abroad, they cease to be under the jurisdiction of Ukraine. They lose their political rights. So this unique formula of those who look for temporary refuge, it preserves the connection to Ukraine. It creates the condition when we as a society, we see them, because at some moment they may move to another jurisdiction which is undesirable for us. Thank you very much, dear friends. Do we have any more questions? Now that we don't have questions on the floor, we may probably summarize. Me as a communication person, I've seen some moments here that are worth attention. For example, that the people trust more social networks rather than official mass media, and in continuation of this statement, the aggregators of news unfortunately are read more than initial sources. This is a problem, in my opinion. What are the trends that you've seen? What should be paid attention to? Yes, and those trends, they are not unique for the citizens abroad. They are very alike with what's going on inside Ukraine. What we've seen in that study, first, that matters of demographics and migration, they cause an effect issue, Because if we take the number of people in Ukraine or abroad and don't observe it in the term, we don't relate it to some events, for example, some military situation unfolding in Ukraine, we don't know how to properly communicate it to the partners, what's the type of infrastructure that requires the most protection, or what is the weapon necessary for Ukraine to decrease the flow of migrants that is related to destruction of civil infrastructure. And then we were having another research that we did not present today in Poland. It was the first one. It was covering a number of issues, and we observed the trend. The first research, it was in the last year, and these are the most recently updated figures and data. And in Poland we see that only 9% of the citizens were checking the local news sources, and after certain period this number grew up to 13%. So the people who stay in those countries, they get integrated. It's not a unique conclusion, but it's just the confirmation of trend and facts, and the longer the war continues, the more Ukrainians will integrate in the society of the country, of their state. But again, to communicate the strategies of the country in terms of security of the sovereignty and territorial integrity, we have to provide all this information to our partners so they understand that this statement that Ukrainians will be supported as long as it's necessary, it's not satisfactory for us. We want Ukraine to be supported all the time by the partners, but the long war will result in loss of connection between our people who look for temporary refuge because they just integrate into the society of the country of their state, which means that Ukraine will lose a part of their human resources potential. And we've seen that Ukrainians want to take part in the political life of Ukraine from abroad, and that's another way to come back or to create some channels, to establish some channels for further reintegration of Ukrainians, no matter when they are. Now, the worst thing that can happen is when those in Ukraine may cut the connection, someone betrayed someone and someone has left, or someone was left in Ukraine, and it will become a topic for the rift, political rift in Ukraine. So those who take part in the political life, they should say that the global political nation of Ukrainians is a winning strategy for the state, because for those who come back and those who don't come back and those who never even left, they should understand that every Ukrainian, everyone who has Ukrainian passport is the agent of influence of Ukraine, no matter where they are. It should be transformed from weakness that a lot of Ukrainians have left into the power that we have a big number of people who are interested in systemically working in the interest of Ukraine, even if they reintegrate in the other societies, even no matter that we may not want it. And all the information about the communication channels is the stimuli for reflections. What should be the methods, the channels that should be used to preserve the connections with Ukrainians no matter where they are? So if we orient at the traditional media or television or radio or something like that, we don't receive the proper coverage of our target audience. So I'm talking about education, mobilization, about the remote integration after 2 years of COVID restrictions, after 1 year of war, after the work of government and non-government organizations in a remote format. We should realize that we should look for more approaches to the human resources, and for education all those studies should be interesting, because both the government and other organizations may find it interesting. And the last thing I want to say, we are absolutely convinced that if we don't diverge from this discourse that political life may be reestablished only when the full-scale war ends, we lose the reintegration accent both inside and outside the country, because politics is the participation of people in management of their state. If we put a period there for 2, 3 or 5 years, we unfortunately cut the connections for the way of the Ukrainians to influence the political life. So to overcome all those challenges that we're facing today, we shouldn't decrease the role of democracy in Ukraine. We should rather talk about the processes that will be actual within a couple of years, but they should be worked upon more and more now. Some may think that they pay for the political commercials in Ukraine and abroad on YouTube but so you're mistaken if you think so. It's a lengthy process. Just imagine the scale of the problems, and based on those figures, let's think about the global reintegration that is a political aspect too. I would like to thank you for this profound conversation. I want to thank the representatives of the media for their interest to this topic. Thank you very much for your participation. I want to thank our armed forces for opportunity to hold events like this, and I'm reminding you, dear colleagues, our next event is at 1500 and we'll talk about the pathway of Ukraine to NATO, so stay tuned. Let's work together for our victory, and glory to Ukraine.